So, look, it's a real pleasure to be here. Oh, I've been told to wrap up now. There we go. That's never happened to me. That's never happened to me before. So look, it's really good to be here. Thanks for the lovely introduction. It's important to be here. Don't need to tell you, 2021 is the year cyber harm came to Ireland in a really obvious way. But I wanted to talk about, because I know with various CISOs in the audience, I know with lots of other people who are trying their best to make the digital environment better and safer, that you've always got problems of traction. And who knows, maybe the ransomware thing will come and go. Hopefully it will get a bit less hectic and manic on the ransomware front than it did last year. But the problems of intrinsic insecurity in the digital environment aren't going to go away, and we're here to try and make that better. And one of our enemies of trying to make it better, which didn't apply in 2021 because harm was so visible, is getting a realistic appraisal of the threat, not so much the threat, but actually the harm. You know, everybody here is working for organizations that will do something else, or with customers who are there to do something else. Ultimately, the goal of our society is not cybersecurity. It's just general prosperity. It's creating wealth and happiness in a safe enough digital environment. So when you've got all the priorities, people say, well, what's all this cybersecurity stuff about? So I wanted to go through essentially three things. I wanted to talk to you about about harm. What actual harm are we here to defend against? How likely is it? And what sort of harm do individual organizations face, and how do you assess that? I want to talk about harmers. Who do you have to worry about and why? And then I want to talk a little bit about harm reduction. I just want to say, in terms of Bob's presentation, I really like that realism. It's really easy to overhype things and to inflate threat in ways that sooner or later people get wise to it and your credibility diminishes. So, for example, the double extortion bit that he just mentioned, that brilliant presentation on ransomware, I'll be a lot less technical. But the double extortion threat from data leaks, actually, you know, disruption of networks from ransomware is a real visible problem with loads of direct evidence, as we can all see, that is happening. Data leaks, funnily enough, as he said, not so much. It's there as part of the threat. It does happen. But actually, apart from just the sheer volumes of data, responsible media organizations in, for example, the HSE crisis in Ireland, weren't going to start publishing easily accessible guides to patient data. We need to be highly realistic and focused about the threat. I only caught the second half of Bob's presentation, but he seems to have talked about Star Wars, so I'm going to continue with the Hollywood vein, and I'm going to start with this whole realism of threat and talk about war games. Many people in the audience have seen war games all the way back in 1983. Excellent. Now, last weekend I decided to rewatch war games for two reasons. One, to show the children, and secondly, because part of my shtick was saying that war games had done sort of harm to the cyber narrative by overhyping the threat and mischaracterizing it. I thought, well, it's been a while since I've watched it, and given this is part of my stable talk, I should rewatch it. And part of it's absolutely brilliant. I mean, astoundingly ahead of its time, given that in 2 years' time it'll be 40 years old. The whole idea, the nonsensical idea of taking humans out of the loop. Humans couldn't be trusted, so we should build a machine in charge of nuclear weapons, which, as the whole basis of the movie goes somewhat awry. The idea that every system has some vulnerability, perhaps deliberately inserted by a backdoor, if not accidentally. The vulnerability of easy mistakes. A really stupidly easily guessable password from Professor Falcon of his son. So really, really powerful stuff. But I stand by the narrative that I've got there, which is through no fault of the excellent filmmakers and the wonderful acting and script. It did set a tone. It captured a tone. It's not its fault, but it did set a tone about the catastrophization of cybersecurity in a way that just doesn't match reality. So what does it do? It says that essentially cyber is about conflict. It will be harnessed by nation states to do things that will cause absolute cataclysm, existential risk. And the crucial point there is that it infantilizes people, because it implies that this is a harm so big, so militarized, that A, it's not really likely to happen to you and me, and B, that if it does, there's absolutely nothing you can do about it. You have to get a teenager to abscond from FBI custody, race across to an island in California, and harness a long-retired professor out of retirement to go and break the Pentagon's systems. Now, funnily enough, I'm not going to tell you how to do that today, because I don't know. Also, it's worth remembering that 38 years on from that film, nothing remotely like this has ever actually happened. So I know you're going to go through hundreds of slides today, but I'm just going to call up one, if I may. As was mentioned, I ran cybersecurity in the UK for 6.5 years. If it doesn't come up, it doesn't really matter. But there we are. I don't know if you can see that. I can see it over there. But when I first left in September last year, I did an immediate sort of capture. It wasn't philosophical. I wasn't trying to prove anything, but I was trying to say, look, this is what I saw. These are the categories of harm. And I wanted to reprise it today, because everyone can talk about ransomware. And ransomware is the theme of 2021. But there are other types of real harm. I would view them as chronic rather than catastrophic. They're often small scale. They matter to the organization, the institution, the individual to whom they are targeted, where it takes place. Even then, they may be relatively small scale, but they act cumulatively. They aggregate into a huge societal, national and international problem. And that's what we want to get after. So the three categories, the first, for those who can see it, was essentially about getting robbed. There is an awful lot of data theft that can, there's an awful lot of cash theft that can range from the small amounts of skimming pensioners' savings and so on, all the way through to the North Korean bank heists like the Bank of Bangladesh in 2015, where they were getting the endpoints of the SWIFT system, which was weakly secured at the endpoint, started cashing out, including, quite glamorous tradecraft like through casinos in Manila, had made off with $81 million and would have made off with $850 million serious money had not an eagle-eyed regulator in Federal Reserve in New York spotted a mistake in the English language. We talk a lot about IP theft. 5-6 years ago, an absolute obsession of the Obama administration in terms of what they perceived to be consistent loss of intellectual property and business opportunity through hacks from the People's Republic of China. Of course, the Chinese will retort back that this was common practice by Western powers for many decades. And we saw, I think, a return of the threat to IP in a big way last year with vaccine development. Small organizations, one close to where I work elsewhere in the University of Oxford, the Jenner Institute, a small biomedical research institution suddenly thrust into the center of geopolitics and, funnily enough, not particularly well prepared for it and needing great assistance to cope with the range of cyber actors now suddenly interested in it. Data theft. I think, and this will be interesting for a longer discussion, we misunderstand data theft. We all talk about data as a commodity. It's a legal and an illegal commodity. Why do people hack lists of Ticketmaster's customers? If you've ever been on, as I'm sure you have, Troy Hunt's excellent haveibeenpwned.com and find what data breaches you're on, you might wonder, A, what do they want with that? And B, what are they going to do with my name, email address, and the last 4 digits of my bank of my bank card? But through excellent law enforcement and other analysis, we now know that there's resale, there's a huge data economy, and there are more significant cyber attacks. We misunderstand this in the public discourse about the difference between a small data set, but with loads of personal identifiers, like, say, a security clearance form, which I'll come on to, versus a very large data set, which has relatively limited information and therefore more limited value. So that is a category of real persistent harm. All of these attacks of some sort are happening right now. And it's getting robbed. It's an economic, a social, a prosperity issue. At a more strategic level, I think there's getting weakened. espionage is abundant in cyberspace. I first noticed it when working for the UK government in 2009, when the UK hosted the post-financial crash G20 summit, which many of us in the trade came to know as a sort of international festival of digital espionage with some economic summitry on the side. An extraordinary sort of awakening of the way in which states could use digital espionage, east and west, all across the world, in ways to further their own objectives. But in terms of doing strategic harm, if you go back to data theft, and I'll dwell on this a little bit later, I think the most strategically impactful hack that I've ever come across is the hack allegedly or confirmed by the Americans to be from the Chinese state of the Office of Personnel Management, the US Civil Service database in 2015. And that was 21.4 million security clearance records of everyone who'd applied for a federal government job in the US in the first 14 years of this century. And just pause on that, because I don't know about you, but if you've ever had to fill in a government security clearance form at the advanced level, you tell them absolutely everything. Every primary identifier and every secondary identifier is now gone. That is strategic espionage impact. Then, of course, you move on to the current era. You have the US accusing the Russians of the SolarWinds operation, a very stealthy, reasonably sophisticated supply chain update poisoning, which gives access to US government and big tech business for up to 9 months. So you get that sort of harm. We talk increasingly about political interference, the sowing of discord, not particularly in terms of a political objective, but if you take, for example, what the US have accused the Russians of in 2016, and what other Western countries have accused Russia and other countries of doing subsequently, is actually using not just disinformation, which is a different problem, but using hacking to foment political discord. In a sense, it's espionage, except you don't keep it secret. Nobody objects to espionage in sort of Geneva Convention terms. It's allowed. But people do object to, for example, if you take the operation the US have said the Russians did against the Clinton campaign in 2016. The first stage of it is just espionage. Secretary Clinton was well on her way. It was believed at the time, didn't turn out that way, to be the next president of the United States. It'd be somewhat odd if the Russians weren't spying on that campaign, and most American national security professionals would have been unsurprised and not particularly objecting of that. The difference is publishing all the information at a particular time in a particular way to weaken the political strength of the US system in a way that we've seen them try in other countries such as the UK and France with less success. There's then, and we have seen cases of this here in Ireland, what people will call pre-positioning. When I was head of the National Cybersecurity Centre in the UK, and you can see this in the annual reports, the latest of which was published yesterday, they categorised the incidents, we did about 7,000 incidents in my day, into two ways. One is called RTU, reported to us. In other words, somebody notices something and says, can you help? And if we could, we did. And the other was DBU, detected by us. In other words, the victim organisation knew absolutely nothing about it, but it was detected by the state using its elite lawful capabilities. So they tended to be more specific and more sophisticated and more targeted. You would get them, and there was plenty of coverage of an incident in the energy sector in Ireland a few years ago. You detect them. They're unlike, unlike some of the other intrusions, they're trying not to be caught. In IP theft and data breaches, most hackers that I've come across in significant incidents don't care about being caught after the event. Pre-positioning, you want to stay there undetected for as long as you can, preferably in perpetuity. So someone like the National Cybersecurity Centre or a partner finds it, and you think, what's that doing there? And you can't ask it because it's a piece of highly sophisticated code, and you certainly can't ask who put it there. What you can surmise, based on lots of experience and looking at analysis of the motivations of potentially hostile states and looking at what other looking at the sort of networks they're in, you can surmise that they're there as essentially a beachhead should things get more difficult and they want to use it for disruptive attack later in the future. So a real significant weakening of your strategic position. When we talk about offensive cyber operations, I think it's commonly misunderstood, certainly among policymakers, that they're just these capabilities that you can just fire off at somebody. If I'm in a state of tension with you and I have an implant on your network and then we make peace and then all of a sudden I get into tension over here, I can't just take it from there and fire it over there. It takes a very, very long time. So you see, even in peacetime and times of relative calm, you see a lot of this very difficult and sophisticated pre-positioning of implants. Pausing there just for a second, I think what you will notice about these 2 categories and 6 items of cyber harm, they're mostly silent. Sometimes they're sort of tangible and measurable in terms of, you can certainly measure cash theft. You can measure to some extent the impact of IP theft. You can measure to some extent the impact of data theft. But it's quiet and there's no sort of social disruption coming off it, other than you get an odd data breach notice and unfortunately your bank account might be lighter than it previously was. But I think we're now getting into the stage increasingly, and 2021 has brought this into sharp focus, where people are starting to get hurt. We have deliberate, targeted, destructive attacks. Not an attack that hurts somebody, but if you want a measure of the sophistication of potential destructive attacks, look at what happened to the French TV station TV 5 Monde in 2015. Hackers operating from outside France in an incredibly sophisticated operation, taking out a broadcasting network for 11 hours, putting it back on, which was harder than actually deleting it, and in a sense a proof of concept that perhaps there are a relatively small number of accomplished state actors, and they're all state actors who can do who can do this, perhaps approximating a bit more of the war games type capability. But a lot of the destruction has been accidental. When people say to me, why would anybody target my business? I say, well, the 2 most difficult incidents of my career were within 6 weeks of each other in 2017. The so-called WannaCry worm, an incredibly badly designed piece of ransomware that ripped through 100 different countries, disrupted the British NHS. If it's a real ransomware attack, probably the single stupidest target on planet Earth to try and extort money out of, both for reasons of public policy and lack of money in the first place. It disrupted the signs on railway platforms in Germany, which I struggle to think was the target of the North Koreans. And 6 weeks later, you had NotPetya. If you want to look at destructive attacks, many experts will point you towards the apparent Russian activity against Ukraine, turning out the supply of electricity in central Kiev in 2015, but also having a go at a professional services firm in Ukraine in 2017, with something that then went viral, left 20% of the world's merchant shipping floating around being controlled by WhatsApp, because Maersk, the Danish shipping giant, was disrupted. But lest you think Maersk were targeted, another victim was production at a chocolate factory in Tasmania, which I definitely struggle to think was the intended target. And then we get to ransomware. I don't need to reprise the ransomware crisis, let alone here. But I will say this about ransomware. We're only talking about it this audience would have been talking about it a few years ago, but we're only talking about it in mainstream terms these days because of its social disruption. And the paradox, to go back to the war games analogy, is that it hasn't been states that have been disrupting healthcare, disrupting energy supplies in the US, disrupting food production in the US and food distribution in Sweden and schools in London, and I could go on. It's been criminals using medium sophistication, but with reckless abandon. And that is taking us closer, but there's an asterisk there because it hasn't happened yet, that is taking us closer to the potential catastrophic impact of cyber harm. So the reason I put this up, I'll leave it on for a few minutes, the reason I put this up was that I find this helpful when you're going to boards, and the board conversation is so important, and just to say, where in this matrix is your organization? Is it a data-rich organization? Has it got a particular piece of IT? Is it strategically significant in the political system? Is it strategically significant in terms of something that someone would want to preposition on? Everyone's at risk of the destructive attack and so forth. And it helps you target. It also then helps you think about the harmers. We don't, for example, have, for now, a problem with international terrorism and serious cyber disruption, because they cannot acquire the sorts of capabilities that needs to see in time, effort, money, skilled people, and infrastructure to do it. But we do worry about nation states, particularly the further down and right you go on this grid. And of course, cyber criminality is out of control. So to finish, I want to talk a little bit about harm reduction. And I want to just say one thing about, two things, first, about how we think about this problem before saying a further few things about how we respond to it. The first is, I don't think we've had an honest enough conversation about the limitations to what traditional organs of the state can do, particularly law enforcement. I'm struggling to remember, in terms of, say, an EU country, the UK, or the Five Eyes Alliance, I'm struggling to think of the last time there was a major gang operating at large scale in the way some of the ransomware operators are doing from within any of those jurisdictions. Because it's crazy. You couldn't hide it. The police would kick down the door. So they don't operate from there. They operate, as President Biden has said, from Russia, from other countries, from parts of the Indian subcontinent, sometimes from parts of Africa, from places where it's hard to get traditional law enforcement mechanisms to work. And we need to understand that, because it limits what we can normally do. For the first time in human history, you're able to cause large-scale harm to a society without ever setting foot in it or getting an accomplice to set foot in it. And that's something that we really need to think about. The second thing is, can you hack your way back out of this? There's been a lot of discussion and coverage this week and this month about US-led operations against ransomware operators, and they're great. Disrupting their infrastructure, outing them, sending arrest warrants. If some of them, the affiliates are based in places like Romania and Ukraine, you can get at them and so forth. But it is tactical. And you can hack your way back a bit out of it, particularly against cyber criminals. But often, as with the Emotet group that were disrupted in January this year, they seem to be, the Emotet botnet people, they seem to be back. And it's a very limited toolkit when it comes to nation states. So we do have to think about our own defences. I just want to make 4 points. One is the importance of basics. I know it's a cliche, I know it's not lost on this audience, but it really has to be said. Every hack that I've mentioned, every major incident, even the most sophisticated ones, part of the story is some element of basic vulnerability. So the very first incident I dealt with when the NCSC was stood up was a brute force attack on Camelot, the UK's national lottery operator, with more than 10 million UK subscribers. Two-factor authentication wasn't on. It is now. Simple. Similarly, the attack on the Westminster Parliament, same thing. At organisational level, anomaly detection and network monitoring. Look at the espionage attack and go back to that attack I described as the most strategically impactful espionage operation of the digital age, the Chinese against the Americans. There are parts of that story that are really sophisticated, which in the interest of time I won't go into. But another part of the story involves the hackers copying the database using the American government's own computing power for 26 hours, loads of it, and nobody noticed. Continuously. So at 3 a.m, the whole thing was just blazing and the data was retrievable, but nobody was looking. So I think patching, as Bob mentioned, again, one of the major incidents just before the NCSC was set up, one of the reasons it was set up was the TalkTalk hack in the UK, done by teenagers using a SQL injection of an exploit older than they were, again, because patching hadn't been done and basic integration of a data set from an acquisition hadn't been done. So the basics really matter is the first point. The second is resilience and preparation and the way in which systems are architected. We don't want to be in the position again where you have to rely on the heroics of people helping with the HSE response. And I'm profoundly shaken by the Colonial Pipeline experience because it broke the first rule of critical infrastructure technology. It wasn't a hack on the pipeline, it was a hack on the enterprise network. And all the guarantees that I heard hundreds of times all over the world from every critical infrastructure company I ever heard of, which is that the operational technology is sufficiently segregated from the enterprise technology, broke down in that specific case. This really shouldn't be happening. We need to design security into the systems in a way, if you want an example, you could look at the UK National Cybersecurity Centre's blog on UK smart meters, where they're not immune from hacking in any way. But if you want to do national level harm, you have to work really, really hard. So it's basics, resilience. The third thing is about the conversation with boards. I think we have to bring this to life with boards and decision takers, whether in government or the private sector. We have to talk to them about whether it's this model or another model, it doesn't matter. We have to talk to them about the reality of harm and the real risks, but then talk about things and educate them about counter-phishing strategies, about how to interpret the ethical phishing test. No, a click rate going down from 25% to 10%. It's decent progress, but it's not the whole story if the 10% includes the systems administrator, the people with the keys to the kingdom. Also, 10% isn't zero, so somebody's got in. What happens then? Where are the defences? Where do they kick in? And there was a kind reference to the UK National Cybersecurity Centre's publications. The one I would recommend for that conversation is the board toolkit. Getting a board to appreciate 5 basic, slightly technical questions about the cyber defences of an organisation. But what's really important to me about that is that we have to tell boards to get a little bit technical. I've never seen a board say, pension liabilities, terribly complicated. Can we get someone in to do a PowerPoint presentation on it so we can, so that we can tick the box? That happens too often in cyber. And my final point, though, is, and it sounds slightly schmaltzy, but I believe in it passionately, is about our digital environment. I strongly believe that we shouldn't be talking about cyberspace in militaristic terms, a domain of operations. Yes, it is a domain of operations. NATO says so, and rightly so. But it's more an environment. And we learned that, if we didn't already know it, during the pandemic. It's somewhere where we went to live and work online. It saved us professionally and personally during the pandemic, and it's full of rubbish. It's full of structural insecurities. It's full of things we can do something about. It's full of brand spoofing. So why aren't we using more, DMARC more widely? It's full of maliciously hosted websites. Why aren't we getting people to take those down a bit more? And in areas like IoT, we have a real opportunity, never mind AI, quantum and so forth, to actually look ahead, look at the technology that's coming and clean up the digital environment. And in that way, we will get rid of more of this harm, more of this time for more of the people. And thanks for listening to me. I am obliged to mention that I've received no payment for this talk other than a selection of Irish crisps, which I will be enjoying enormously for the rest of the day. I'll be around for questions, but I won't be sharing the crisps. Thank you.